Hi everyone and welcome back to One Autistic Person. The video that I'm creating today is looking at the three possible routes that you can go down to get an assessment for autism within the UK. There are three main routes that you can go down, and I'm going to look at those today. I apologise in advance. This is a much more scripted video for me, and I struggle quite a lot with scripted videos. Not necessarily because of the script itself, as in if I just did bullet points, but I find it impossible to do that, and I end up writing a whole essay and then get very stuck in that. So I'm going to do my best with this because this is new for me. I usually just talk. Every time I've scripted, it's kind of been quite difficult for me. So please bear with me. Also, a bit of an apology. I do personally have struggles with the NHS. I really struggle to navigate the NHS. So sometimes I may come across that I'm being negative about the NHS. I'm really not. I understand it's due to resource issues, but I personally find, especially when it comes to mental health services, that the NHS is quite complicated when it comes to accessing services, and I don't think it's set up personally for my way of my brain processing neurodivergency. So it may sometimes sound like I am being quite harsh on them. That isn't my intention. I'm just trying to be honest with people as much as possible with it. So that's my little preamble to that. So I'm not meaning to be negative, and I don't actually see the NHS as a whole in a bad light, and I do understand the reasons for it. I'm just talking from my experience and how difficult I found it to navigate the NHS. I'm basically giving my suggestion of which route to go down, but it is only my opinion and only comes from my experience of things. So there are three roads to diagnosis within the UK. There's NHS internal referral from either a GP or mental health services. There's NHS Right to choose, and there's private. In this video, I will break down the options and what you may experience during that process from my experience and from talking to other people about what experiences they've had as well. So I've spoken to a few people that I know that have gone through all of these different routes at different stages in their life as well. So I'm going to go through it, starting with the NHS internal referral. So this process requires you to go to your GP, explain to them your current situation, why you feel you need an autism assessment. They will probably give you some short pre-screening questions. I think they'll probably give you, quite often it's the AQ10, which is a reduced version of the AQ that I'm going through in the other videos that I'm doing. So that one's 50 questions, whereas this one's 10. And that kind of is just a precursor to, should we then put you forward for a referral for an assessment for autism. My understanding of it, of the NHS's referral process, is that if you have it fully internally, there is pretty much a waiting list for each one. So for each section of what the process, for each step of the process. So there's a waiting list for the initial pre-screening. So there's a lot. So the AQ50 that I'm going through, but also the background information and things like that. So there's a waiting list for that. You will then be put on a waiting list for each one of the assessments that you have. So there'll be the ADOS 2, probably. I mean, that's the general gold standard, but it might not be. But that's the general one, and then there will be an informant assessment. So somebody who's known you for most of your life, often a parent or a sibling, or somebody who's known you a really long time. There are other processes that you can go through if you don't have that as an option. So it can be somebody who's known you for a relatively long period of time, along with having a conversation with you, or it may just be a conversation with you about as much as you can remember about your past. So as I go through this, I'm going to mention NICE quite often. Now, NICE is it's an overarching body that oversees the diagnosis process of any condition within the NHS, and it's again the gold standard that is used to ensure that people are being diagnosed effectively, consistently, and they will communicate any changes to how the diagnosis process needs to happen, and the NHS always use NICE as for their guidelines, and many private companies do. As I will talk to you about when we talk about private companies, you always need to make sure that they are NICE registered, and that they are being overseen by NICE, simply because of the fact that that means you will get generally you will get a effective assessment, but also when it comes to your GP accepting the fact that that diagnosis is a correct diagnosis, it really enhances the fact that they will do that, because they don't have to take a private diagnosis as a correct diagnosis, and you don't want to go through any process and then find out that actually your GP is not going to accept it, and schools aren't going to accept it, and nobody's going to accept it if that's the case. So we'll get on to researching afterwards anyway. So NICE's guidelines when it comes to waiting lists, that nobody should be waiting for either an autism or an ADHD diagnosis for longer than 13 weeks. But unfortunately, this is often not the case. From my research, it looks like about 86% of all new referrals are not being seen within this time. So that's the number that I found on the NHS's website as well. So they have publicised the fact that that is the case. So they are really struggling with this at the moment due to a lot more people going forward for the assessment. And obviously, as I've said, there are resource issues within the NHS generally. So it's kind of a two-pronged issue. There's not the resources, and there's more people seeking an assessment. I looked into my sort of localish areas. So I live in Yorkshire, and according to the NHS website, in Sheffield, the average waiting time for an assessment is currently 66 weeks. So when you think about that, that's a year longer than what the highest amount should be. And that, when I say the 13 weeks, the whole process, that should be the whole process. So it's the whole process from the first time you have a conversation through to diagnosis, or from referral, should I say. So from referral to diagnosis. And like I say, 86% of people are not getting that. And in the Sheffield area, that's 66 weeks. When it comes to, so you're talking a year and 14 months, a year and 14 weeks. So a year and 3 months and a bit. We've also got Leeds and York, which is between 22 and 27 months, which is sort of 2 years-ish. And then I looked into Kent, simply because I used to live in Kent years ago, and I know how stretched their NHS services generally were. And this one was I couldn't find anything on the NHS website about it, which was worrying. But scarily, I read in Kent Online, on a Kent Online article, which is generally quite a good source of information, but I don't know about the accuracy of this one, and they were saying that it was taking up to 7 years for either an autism or an ADHD diagnosis. Like I say, kind of take that one with a pinch of salt, because it is done through media rather than it coming directly from the NHS, but I couldn't find anything on the NHS website. They were very cagey about it, and were saying about the fact that it was extended waiting times. They didn't say anything. So maybe not 7 years, but I feel like that does implicate the fact that it potentially is taking much longer than it should do, which we know that it is. So from what I could work out, I looked at 20 different areas. I didn't include the 7-year one in this because I didn't find it was accurate enough. But it looks like from those that it's anywhere between 20 and 22 months seems to be the average amount of time that it's taking. So it's taking between up to 2 years from referral to diagnosis. So that said, they're quite long waiting times, as I think we're all aware of. From my experience of when I've gone through any referral through the NHS, and from speaking to other people who went through this, both from a CAMHS perspective, so from a children and adolescent mental health services, and from an adult perspective, so I've spoken to people who have done both, they found that the process was very rigid, that there's a lot of chasing up that needs to be done, so you don't have any control over what happens, which at the end of the day, the NHS is a free at the point of service, so therefore I understand the rigidity, but if rigidity is going to be a problem for you, then there maybe look at one of the other options that we're going to look at. There's lots of chasing, which is something I have a major problem with because I will leave it until way too late. And things often getting lost in the system and having to wait for months for a diagnosis after the assessment. So this was something that came up quite a few times when speaking to people, is it seems like people are getting the assessment within that sort of 22 months, within 2 years. So it's taking 2 years to get to that point, but then they're waiting 3 or 4 months or even longer. Did speak to somebody who was taking 6 months and they still haven't had their actual diagnosis. They don't know whether they've been diagnosed as autistic or not, and there's no way of finding this out. There's no way of giving any information because the person you speak to is not the person who's diagnosing you, which is kind of correct with a multidisciplinary team. That's the way it should be. There shouldn't necessarily be people that you're talking to all the time that are diagnosing you. But when I say rigidity as well, sorry, flicking back and forth here, when I had my diagnosis for autism, it was through a private diagnosis, and I was able to communicate in the ways that I wanted to communicate. So if I found communicating in writing better over the phone, that there was really just email or phone, and the actual assessment done over a video call. But the options were there, and it seems like it is a bit more difficult when it comes to the NHS, and getting the response back if you do it in writing is really difficult, and waiting on the telephone for a really long time seems to be common. And you will get answers, but it's often that they don't know what's happening and they'll let you know, but they're not sort of forthcoming with the progress of anything. So yeah, and like I say, that waiting after the assessment for a really long time, I completely understand it. There's obviously a report that needs to be done with that, which means admin and admin staff are under so much pressure to be writing up reports, and they've got to make sure it's accurate. So I understand the reasoning for it, but just as a sort of understanding of this, that's a possibility from what I found out. They're also pretty much always carried out face to face. From my understanding of it, that this is. And I found this with mental health services as well. So if you really struggle with face-to-face and you really feel that you would prefer to do it online, I think there are ways that can happen. But I think it's down to your individual NHS trust to whether they will do video, whether they'll do video assessments, or whether the reasonable adjustments are there for people who can't go to a face-to-face assessment. And also, from my understanding of it, this also takes longer as well. So you're adding more time onto the possibility of when you will actually have your assessments. And bearing in mind, an autism assessment has 2 parts to it, that could add quite a lengthy amount of time onto it. Also, the thing with the NHS in general is you don't really have a choice of who does your assessment. So when you're going either through Right to Choose or private, which are quite similar when it comes to choosing things, you can research the company, the people diagnosing you, the organisation, and you can research the consultant. Now, obviously, you're going to find that you'll be able to once you know who that consultant is, but there's not really any way of changing that once you've gone through that process. So again, you're going into it quite uninformed about who it is that's going to do it, and the NHS don't really have a review system. They do, but it's not quite the same as it is for other organisations. So yeah, for me, it feels like the NHS internal referral system seems to be long-winded, not set up, like I say, for neurodivergent people, not giving options for reasonable adjustments, and it can be quite a complicated and long process. So that's the NHS. That's the NHS internal referral. Now, Right to Choose is kind of a step between private and the NHS. So the Right to Choose scheme is a scheme that's being set up between the NHS and multiple private companies that do that have people who are trained to NICE standards. So they, like I say, they're trained to NICE standards, but they are a private company, and the NHS pays them a fee for doing it, but it's still done through the NHS. So it's ensuring that when I was saying about private assessments earlier, again, jumping everywhere, when I was saying about private assessments earlier, not being sure on whether a GP will take the diagnosis if you get it, then this is an automatic they would, because it is being outsourced for all intents and purposes. And this is happening more and more. So you can choose whoever you want to use as long as they are part of the Right to Choose scheme. So when I was talking previously about you don't know who you're going to get within the NHS, you're not necessarily going to know which person does your assessment within one of these organisations, but what you can look at is the ethos of the organisation. You can see how they diagnose, you can see how the assessments work. So it allows you to choose a provider that has a contract with the NHS to perform your assessment. This is like having a private diagnosis, but it is paid for and arranged by the NHS. And basically, it costs the NHS the same amount of money. I have heard and I have found this. So having had a private diagnosis and then a private assessment, and then going through getting an ADHD assessment through Right to Choose, there is a difference between the way you're treated, which you would expect. They are being paid less for doing this, and they have an influx of people who are being assessed. So, and there is a massive backlog for them in comparison to the private assessment, which I'll come on to afterwards. So for me, the process that you will go through with Right to Choose is, and this is how I did it with ADHD. So I felt I needed to get an ADHD assessment for various reasons. One, because I personally felt that I had ADHD. I have researched it myself, but also during my autism assessment, I was categorically told you should go and get an ADHD assessment. Now, the reason why I didn't go private with this is because it's a minefield for me with ADHD, because of the titration process. When I started looking into the titration process, it just became very confusing, and I thought, well, if I go through Right to Choose, they'll deal with all of that, and I won't have to navigate it quite as much, and therefore I won't need to get confused by it. But a really important part of the process with Right to Choose is that once you realise that you want to have an ADHD assessment, that you feel you need an ADHD assessment, you research which organisation you would like to carry out your assessment, because that's the really important part of this. Because yes, the waiting lists are slightly shorter for this, or relatively much shorter, should I say, but the main point of doing this for me is the fact that I get to choose the company that will suit me best. So if you don't want to do face-to-face assessment, then go for a company that doesn't do that does both face-to-face or just and video, or just video. You can look at the background and history of the people who work for the organisation. You can look at their reviews. You can look at what I would say, if you're looking at the reviews, don't just look at the negative ones, because there's always going to be people who have negative reviewing. It's the same as like holidays and things like that. People quite often put negative reviews on only when they are angry. Only put reviews on when they're angry, therefore only putting a negative review. And there are going to be people who haven't gone through a good process, and especially at the moment, there is going to be hit and miss, but there's hit and miss within the NHS. So you're not taking any more risks, in my view, than you would be going through the NHS for this. But look at a full picture of it and get what you think, but also research the consultants, research the psychiatrists that work there. Look at their history and see how they've fared in their career, because I think that's really important. You can go in with that knowledge. Look at their process. You can ask them what their waiting lists are and see what suits you best. So once you've done that, the next bit to do is to book a GP appointment. But also, on most of the websites of the organisations that do Right to Choose, they actually have the letter and the initial assessment form. So I think it's the AQ10 again on there, which you can print the form out and take it to your GP appointment. So you can make your appointment with your GP. You'll have the letter, which you just need to change it so that you've got your name on it, and then you sign it at the bottom and address it to your doctor. And then it will have the pre-screening questionnaire, which you will give your answers to on it. And you can have the conversation with your GP, but you can also give your GP the paperwork. And my GP was like, nobody ever comes with all of this already. It's usually you'll tell us who you want, and then we have to print it out. And it shows that you've done your research into it. If they feel that is correct, they will then make a referral. So your GP needs to make a referral through Right to Choose. They will ask you, they will sit and talk to you about why you want to have the assessment. It will be like any other appointment. I found them extremely supportive in this, and sort of said, yeah, we can see why, can see why from the conversation that we're having, but I can also see why from the answers that you've put on your assessment. I would suggest to check for a week or so after this is done to make sure it's done, because when I did mine, I chased it and it hadn't been done, and then it was done that day. So again, NHS is under-resourced, therefore they may miss things and forget things. So it is a matter of, when you're working with the NHS, you do have to kind of push them sometimes. But they are very good, especially, well, my GP was very good at kind of going, oops, sorry, I haven't sent it, which inside I was extremely frustrated by, because it's like, I'm the most important person. Obviously I'm not, but afterwards I was like, okay, she was great with it. She sent the referral off. I then checked up a week after that with the ADHD assessor that I have gone through Right to Choose with, just to make sure that referral definitely had happened, which they did. They got back to me and told me. I have found them that they don't contact you to let you know that, which is quite frustrating. But again, the assessors are overbooked, and that you're going to be going into a waiting list to go to them. It's going to be different for each. It'll be different for each company how the assessment is done and how it's arranged. Some will ring you, I would imagine. Some will email. The one I've gone with specifically use they will text and email you, and they then use an internal system for you to go through the process that you need to set up your assessment. I specifically went with them because of the fact of that, because I have to have very little contact with them until I have to have my assessment, other than in writing. My assessors were great. They got back to me within 24 hours and told me that I had been referred. From a waiting time perspective, when it comes to Right to Choose, it is hugely different depending on the organisation. So the waiting times can be anywhere from, what I could see, 16 weeks to 12 months. I have heard that 12 months with one company, I'm not going to mention companies' names in this because I don't think it's fair to do so. One company is saying 12 months, but there are people being told that it's actually going to be more like 18. That is a company that is getting a lot of extra people coming through, which I will explain to you in a second, after something I experienced the other day. So it just very much depends. The average appears to be about 20 weeks, the 20 weeks mark. Again, that was from 6 different companies that I looked at. No, sorry, it was 8 different companies that I looked at to find that. So that came out at around 20 weeks. It was like 20.2 weeks or something when I did the calculation for it. So I researched what were the companies that were doing Right to Choose, and it came out at around 20 weeks, which is, you're getting on to 6 months at that point. So I would say sort of hold out to anything, probably think 6 months upwards, because I don't see those waiting lists getting any shorter. So an online assessment is common for most assessors. It is standard with an option to have face-to-face if you want this, but it may extend your waiting time. So most external companies to the NHS will offer a face-to-face option. It does tend to increase the amount of time that it takes. Not all do. There are some that only offer online, so just be aware of that as well. If you don't want an online and you want a face-to-face, there are certain ones that will only do online assessments, which is obviously speeding the process up for people, but I know some people won't feel comfortable with that. So make sure you look into that as part of your research into the company, whether they do face-to-face, if that's something that you want to do. So an online, and also most of the assessments that you do, most of the pre-screening questionnaires and everything will be on some kind of system that they use. So it'll be an internal system, or they will give you website links, or there'll be a link to something online for you to do your pre-screening questions at some point prior to your assessment. Usually you'll probably get, from my understanding of it, you'll get given your assessment date, which could be weeks and weeks and weeks in the future, but you'll be given your pre-screening questionnaires to do prior to that date. Often with private companies, there will be much more flexibility with you, both in terms of this assessment date and how they communicate with you. Yes, this is kind of the case, but what I have found is there's less than there is within private. So they will communicate online. Obviously, most of them are online based, so they will communicate through email, which obviously is a huge struggle when it comes to the NHS generally. and they will be a little bit more flexible, but you have to give them a lot of notice of wanting to change your assessment date. But they will give you, from what I've experienced, they'll give you options of when you book your date, which doesn't really happen with it. That doesn't happen in the NHS. You're given your date and you're expected to go on that date. If you're not able to make it, then you're not going to go back through the waiting list, but you are going to go on a waiting list of people who've cancelled their appointments or can't make their appointments. Whereas if you are going through Right to Choose, you're going to be going through a private company where you'll be able to select that. So there is a bit more flexibility when it comes to Right to Choose, but I do think there's more when it comes to private, which we'll get into in a second. Just a note on Right to Choose. So my housemate has asked for an ADHD assessment, which his doctor has felt that he does need a referral for. He was automatically referred, so he didn't know about Right to Choose. I hadn't really had the conversation with him, or I did, and he hadn't heard, and his ADHD brain and my autism and ADHD brain hadn't communicated to a point where he'd heard it. So we spoke about it, and he got his letter through, and his letter actually specifically passed him straight on to had actually passed him straight onto a external company. They put it as a Right to Choose letter, which seems a bit weird, but I think it might just be, it just seems weird wording to call it Right to Choose when you're not actually choosing. They're basically referring you externally, which is fair enough, and I think it's actually a good idea. But the company that they had referred him to is a company with a huge waiting list, and from my understanding has currently got quite a bad reputation. So I sort of gave him different options and said, look, you need to research and have a look at what you think is best for you. What do you want to do, rather than necessarily this being an automatic referral. So it's worth keeping in mind, though, that it looks like the NHS are slowly moving towards, and from what I can research, that company has got a contract with the NHS that they are doing a trial of looking at different ways of working. So that could be really good. As much as I personally feel that this company currently has a bad reputation, historically they actually have quite a good one. It's just, again, overwhelmed with things. So it looks like they've got a contract with the NHS to try and find new ways of working to not necessarily speed the process up, but make it more efficient and more connected, and that it's an automatic external referral, which I personally have no issue with. There should be no problem with that. For me, it takes the pressure off the NHS. So yeah, just to be aware that you might actually get a Right to Choose letter come through, even if you've not specifically asked for Right to Choose. So, but if you do get that, it doesn't mean you have to go with them, because what he's done is put the letter and the assessment in, the assessment questions in, but he has asked to go with a different company. They've just accepted that. So it's fine, because you can use whatever Right to Choose. The whole point of Right to Choose is you can use whoever you want. This is kind of just going, this is an option. It doesn't really tell you to research it, which is a bit frustrating. You should really get a letter from your doctor saying you should really research these. Are you comfortable using them? So yeah, that's and then with that, your diagnosis tends to come quicker. So you won't have to necessarily wait a longer. I think it's between 4 and 6 weeks with the company that I'm going with. It just, again, depends on the organisation that you're working with to how long that will be. You're going to have a wait. I had to wait. I waited 2 weeks, 10 days, I think it was, for my diagnosis letter. But I did have a call prior to that to say that I had been diagnosed as autistic. But then I got my actual diagnosis report through about 10 days after that. So it's just because it's a matter of typing up, isn't it? So it's quite difficult to get that. So you'll have different ways of doing it, and like I say, the way I had it was that I had a video call to talk through it, and then I got the letter, the report through. But they went through the report. I had an hour with them and went through the report. I don't know on Right to Choose how long you would have in that situation. I do feel like they're probably going to be more restrained in the amount of time that they've got because of the number of people that are going through in this situation. But yeah, so Right to Choose is a way of you being able to research and having a little bit more control, and I feel it's more user-friendly than the NHS personally, because you're getting everything that you get generally with private healthcare. You are still getting longer waiting times, and there is some restriction on you can't keep changing appointments and stuff like that, which you're more likely to be able to do if you've got a private company, but they're still not going to want you to keep changing it. But you have more wiggle room if you pay for private than what you would do with Right to Choose, but you have more wiggle room with Right to Choose than you would do with the NHS, because it's not actually getting you're not getting a private service through Right to Choose. You are getting an NHS service, but it is through a private company, which just allows quicker times and more effective technology that's used, and more forward thinking, I think, ways of sort of going through the assessment. I'm not saying that the actual assessment's any more forward thinking, but actually going through the assessment and how to make it easier for them and for you to get the quickest result that you possibly can, while still being effective and working to nice guidelines. So that is Right to Choose. I will give you my opinion of what I think at the end of this. So private, so this has an extra cost element to it, but it does also speed up the process and allow for much more flexibility with dates and working around your needs, from my experience personally. For me, the whole process from inquiring to a diagnosis was 4 weeks, and it could have been quicker. It was actually me that slowed that down, because I needed a week between my assessments, because I couldn't have done both of them too quickly. So the one thing a few things I'm going to say about private is that do not, under any circumstances, put yourself in debt to get an autism assessment. It doesn't achieve anything enough for you to put yourself in debt. Only go for a private diagnosis if you know fully you can afford it. Do not do that. It is not worth it. I will tell you now, it is not worth doing it. You do not get enough benefit from it to not wait the potential 16 weeks or even 12 months for a diagnosis if you cannot afford to get it. And also, if you can do that waiting, just do the waiting. It makes no sense at all to go for a private diagnosis if you are happy with the wait and you're happy with and you don't want to spend the money. Don't feel forced into spending that money. Don't feel like you have to. It will speed the process up, hugely speed the process up, and it will give you that flexibility. But it isn't worth it if you haven't got the money to pay for it. I was very lucky. I had the finances to be able to pay for it at the time. It took me a few months to save up that money, but for me, it was really important for me to get the diagnosis in a way that was good for me. As I've said, I really struggle with the NHS, so I was very lucky to be able to afford it. But I would not have done it if I had have done it and it had not, and I hadn't been able to afford it. I would have been really, really upset, because it doesn't change enough, apart from giving you clarity, for you to not wait that longer period, and the cost element of it doesn't outweigh what it then can do for you, other than clarification and understanding. Because if you're going to ask for an autism assessment, you already pretty much know that you do. So the likelihood is you probably are. So my point is, don't pay for it unless you have the funds to be able to pay for it, and it's not going to put you either in debt or in a financial situation. Do not put yourself in a negative financial situation to get a diagnosis. It really is not worth doing it. It's better to wait. So the costs for it can be anywhere from around £600. That's the cheapest I could find it, but that was a very long waiting list for it. That was a huge waiting list. It was a 6-month waiting list for private, so which is a very, very long waiting list for private. With an average, and up to about 2,500. You can be charged more than that, but 2,500 seems to be kind of the top main amount. And from I think it was 7 companies that I looked at. I haven't typed that there, so I don't know. The average was around £1,300, and some offer payment plans to do it. So that, I have no issue with doing that. Is if you want to pay it in, because I paid mine in 2 halves. Mine cost 2,000. I paid 1,000 and then paid another 1,000. So for me, the process was, so I researched, so I looked at every single autism assessment company that I could possibly find, and I found the right company for me. This was a company that had got really good credentials from what I could see, did everything the way that I wanted it to be done, gave freedom for me to be able to sort of negotiate things myself, negotiate the process myself. That they when I emailed them, they were lovely. I emailed like 5, I think. So I researched the consultant. My consultant was the director of services. Sorry, she was the lead consultant for Wales, for autism and neurodivergent children, and you'll also be able to see what the potential the people will be that will be on the multidisciplinary team. You can do this again with right to choose as well, so you can see who's going to be diagnosing you. So you can see their credentials, you can see what people have said about them. If there's anything negative, you'll know. So then, like I say, research that, then contact the company, see whether you get on with them. So, because it's really important if you're paying, especially if you're paying for an assessment, that that assessment is going to be a positive assessment for you. You might as well go through the right to choose situation or even the NHS situation if you're not going to necessarily work with people who you will feel comfortable about. And they're quite happy to talk to you beforehand. Obviously, not the people who are going to diagnose you, but the company, and you can kind of get a feel for them. You then go through your assessments, and for me, like I say, that was done very, very quickly. I had my first assessment, I think my first assessment was about 10 days after I booked. I paid for my first bit, and then I paid for my second bit, so I paid 1,000, then paid another 1,000, and it was a week that was until the next assessment, and then it was 10 days from that I then got my full diagnosis and the letter and everything. So and then, like I said before, make sure that the company you are working with, if you're going for private or right to choose, is always already going to be registered with NICE, but with a private company, make sure that they are regulated by NICE. The reason why this is because, and also double check with your GP that they will accept a diagnosis from that organisation. Not all GPs will take a diagnosis from certain companies, so just check before you book it whether your GP will accept it, because there is absolutely no reason, no point in you getting a diagnosis for your GP to then not accept it. I have seen this online where people have got the diagnosis, taken it to their GP, and then they've gone, no, we won't accept it. So if they won't, then you'll have to look at different options, because it might be that your GP just will not accept any external diagnosis, which personally I think is shocking, and they shouldn't be allowed to do so. But there are apparently some GPs that do refuse to take them. It is actually down to them whether they do it. So make sure that your GP does accept a private diagnosis, and also that they are NICE regulated, to ensure that you are getting the best standard of assessment that you can possibly have. It's pretty much guaranteed it will need to be NICE regulated for your GP to accept it. Regardless, if they accept it, they will want it to be NICE regulated. Otherwise, they are not going to see it as a gold standard assessment. So yeah, do that before. You check with your GP before. And then give your GP. They will send a copy of your. They may send it or they may not send it. It's up to you and them. Some don't send them. Mine asked me whether they wanted me to send it, wanted them to send it, or whether I wanted to take it. I said for them to send it. I also took a copy of it in there for them as well. So it was both. I always do this, make sure that things like that happen, because I panic about the fact it's not going to happen. Mine was really easy. They took it, accepted it, and have been relatively supportive since. So, waiting lists are for most private companies do not have a waiting list. There are some that do. When I don't have a waiting list, obviously there is a waiting time between booking an appointment and getting your first appointment. Like I say, it was like 2 weeks from when I booked my appointment to actually getting the appointment. There was 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that between that. But there isn't an actual waiting list. It's more like anything else. If you book anything, you're going to have to wait a little time before you get it. I couldn't really do any research into it because there's not really numbers. They don't really give numbers. There were a few that gave them. There was some that there are 6-month waiting lists. Like I said, on the one that costs £600, there is a 6-month waiting list, but that's because they are working with the NHS quite a lot, so you're added into that list, but you won't be pushed back or anything like that. So, but also with it being £600, I kind of think they think, well, were much cheaper than most others, because that was by far the cheapest that I came across. So they probably are thinking we are the lowest priced, and that's probably the reason why they've remained at £600, is to ensure that you're not overly paying for it at the same time as going into a waiting list. So, and I don't, so yeah, that's, most aren't, there's no waiting list. Most you're going to have an appointment within a few weeks, and your diagnosis will be within a month, 6 weeks. So yeah, definitely a much quicker route. Like I say, do not go for it unless you need to, unless you feel the need to do it quicker, and that you have the money to do so. Please do not. I really cannot stress this enough. It is not worth getting a diagnosis and getting yourself in debt to do so. Because, like I say, the benefits of it, it's great that you know, it's great that you have that clarity, but only if you have the money to be able to pay for it. And that is unfortunately where we are with this, because it would be great if everybody could get a diagnosis within 4 to 6 weeks, because you're not going to have to go through the stress of it, but it's way better than the stress of getting yourself into debt because of doing that. So big suggestion from me, do not get yourself in debt. So from my experience, I'd personally say that right to choose is the best option. The waiting time is much shorter. You can do your own research of the assessor, so you don't need to pay for yourself. You can't be as flexible with sort of choices as you might be if you were paying for private, but you do know who could potentially be assessing you as part of that organisation. You can see their ethos, you can see their ways of working, and you know that they're going to work for you. Whereas the NHS is blind, and obviously the private assessments, it's the cost. Having used both, private for me is better, and if I had unlimited funds, I would be getting my ADHD assessment through private as well. The reason why I'm not is I feel like I can't understand what the costs are from a private ADHD assessment, because of the fact you do the assessment, so I understand that cost, and then you have medication appointments and you have titration, which is then they're not able to give you a solid amount of money, and for me that's really, really difficult. I can't deal with the fact that I won't know how much it is. So for me, right to choose is better for ADHD. It is driving me insane, the fact that I'm waiting and don't know when my assessment's going to be, but I am fine with it because I feel like it is the right thing to do. And as much as it's driving me nuts, it's not that bad. I know it's going to happen. I'm aware of the fact that the referral's gone through. I've checked with them. They've told me what the process is. I'm just being me. I'm just panicking about it. I feel, like I say, it was worth every penny for the private assessment for me personally, but I didn't go without to get that diagnosis, and I didn't get myself into debt to do so. So it's only if you can afford it and you really do feel the need to do it quickly, then go for it. Go for a private assessment. It was a brilliant experience. They also allowed me to give information outside of the assessment. They talked to me outside of it, rather than it just being you're restricted to only being able to talk during the assessment about it, which my understanding it from the NHS is less about they don't want you to tell them stuff outside of it. It's just they don't have the resource to add it to your file. Whereas if I remembered something between my assessments, or between booking and my assessment, they allowed me to they actually actively said, if you remember anything else, then give us that information. You're not really going to get that option with the NHS, but you may get it with right to choose, but I kind of don't think you would get it with right to choose either, because of the speed they're going to have to go through things. But so if you need all of those things and you have the funds, I will keep saying this till that my dying day, do not pay for an assessment unless you have the funds to do so. Even if it's stressful, it's better to go through that stress and not put yourself in even more stress with the fact that you have spent money that you don't have. Because I know how important it was for me to have that assessment, and I can imagine me feeling like I really would like to have it, but I haven't got the money. I will borrow it. Don't borrow it. A payment plan is slightly different. So if you're going to pay for part of it and then pay for another part of it, they'll keep the assessment going until you pay the second part. So it's not that bit isn't a problem. So, but it's not like you're paying it monthly and getting interest added onto it or anything like that. You're paying it up front before you do it. So, so for me, I would personally say right to choose is the best option. You are getting it for no extra cost to you. The waiting lists, although still quite long, are not as long as they are going through NHS referral. You're able to research it yourself, you're able to look at reviews, you're able to look at their processes, you're able to have a clear understanding of what that process is going to be for you. Pretty much all of them will give you a really good step-by-step guide of this is how the assessment process works for us. So it takes some of that ambiguity away that you might have if you didn't have that when it comes to the NHS, because they're not necessarily clear with you. They'll just say we're referring you, and then you'll get a letter, and then you don't really know what's going to happen. So yeah, that would be my suggestion, is go for Right to Choose unless you have enough money to be able to pay for a private assessment and you need it, and you feel that it would be beneficial to you to not have to go through that waiting time period, but that you have the money readily available and it's not going to take anything else away from your life, because it won't do anything for you other than clarity. And to be fair, like I've said, most people, I think, that are at a point of going for a diagnosis, I think especially with autism, to get to the point of feeling that you are autistic, when it comes down to things like sensory issues and things like that, you're probably very, very sure of the fact that you are. You could probably be as sure as most people could, anybody could be really, that you are autistic. And I would say you probably are, and not to worry about it, and go through Right to Choose, and don't worry about it until you have your assessment. So, thank you very much for that one. Like I say, this was scripted and a longer one, but I know I've a few times gone off in my own little head a little bit. But I hope that's been helpful to sort of show you what I think, and also talk through the different possibilities that you can go through for different diagnosis paths. And I'd just like to thank everybody for watching my videos, and I hope to see you on the next one. Thank you. Bye.